Well, it's me again, and this is the sixth lecture of chapter one in the psychology textbooks. In the last lecture, we ended up talking about the perspectives in contemporary psychology. We were talking about like evolutionary perspective and the humanist perspective and things like this. There are really only two major topics that I want to cover, and I think I can get both of them covered in this last lecture. One of them is a list of what's referred to as specialty areas in psychology. And what this is really just a list of where you can find psychologists. Like if you were to go on and get a 4 year or 6 years or even a PhD in psychology, the different kinds of things you might do. And one of them, you've got experimental. So these are people that work in labs. Amy Farrah Fowler is an experimental psychologist. She's from the Big Bang Theory, by the way. Developmental psychologist, if you're taking human growth and development, that's all developmental psychology. So you might go into preschool or pediatrics or early childhood development, or you actually might be more interested in late in life development, like hospice care and things like this. You have social psychologists, and they're kind of cool because they blend the sociology and the psychology together. And social psychologist, the one fella that I'm most interested in, his name is Zimbardo. He actually studies evil and does evil exist. And so social psychologists study things like obedience and evil. And a colleague of mine did a lot of research on racism and helping behavior. And so it's all about how psychology affects how you interact with other people. You have personality psychologists, and this is going to be one of the last chapters we cover, is the chapter on personality. My almost brother-in-law, he is a personality psychologist, and what he does is studies different kinds of personality types, and he works for the Department of Defense. And he uses his research and his understanding of personality and human behavior to identify which soldiers, which enlisted people how many employments or deployments, or what kind of positions are most suitable for people who have certain personality characteristics. Personality is defined as patterns of thoughts and behavior that are consistent across time and place. Um, and then there's all these batteries of scales. You have health psychologists, and they're very busy right now with the COVID thing. What health psychologists are interested in is how can we use psychology to improve people's health? Or how can what we know about psychology explain why some people are likely to suffer from certain health problems and not other health problems? So health psychologists are engaged in maybe advocating for mask wearing or public health. A lot of times that's what you'll see in public health. Educational psychologists use what we know about the brain and learning and personality, and they use that specifically for things like intelligence testing, or the special education people that you get in elementary schools or in high schools or even here on college campuses. Those are health psychologists. So if you know anyone that ever had to take one of those tests, to see if they qualify for special ed or ADHD or any of that stuff, those are educational. I'm sorry, those are educational psychologists. Then you have the IO guys. Those guys are kind of cool, and I say guys because everybody I know in IO is a male. But the IO people, they're engaged in, so it's organizational and institutional, industrial and organizational psychologists. They do things like design cockpits and design workstations and even assembly lines. Knowing what we know about the brain and behavior, how can you improve maybe people's productivity or prevent accidents, things like this. So they work with, sometimes they'll be in like marketing research, or in big organizations often have an industrial psychologist, like what are the hierarchies of leadership that would be most suitable, what's too much hierarchy and that kind of thing. They're kind of cool, I think, because I like social groups. And then finally, you have clinical psychologists, and clinical psychologists, those are your therapists, right? Those are the people that are literally working in the clinic trying to use this knowledge to on a clinical level, I know, but to treat or prevent or disorders. So that's the last little topic here. The only other topic to cover, it's a big one, but I don't want to spend too much time on it, partly because my experience is that students are not really interested in it, but it's really important, and that's the discussion about the scientific method. I hope when you were in high school, if you took a science class, maybe some of it sounds familiar, you know, like the goals of science, and that would be a good exam question. What is the goal of psychology? And like I said here in a previous video, is that the social sciences, they all kind of have the same goal. They're all trying to make predictions and explain human behavior. Whereas sociology comes from this big perspective and psychology comes from the small. So the goal of science, the goal of any science, is these first 1, 2, 3, 4 to explain through observation, right? So you describe it. I'm sorry, I got them out of order. You describe what you see, you explain it, and you make predictions about anything, about human behavior, about the weather, about politics, about tree growth, right? It's all the same. That's always the goal. The fourth one, 1, 2, 3, 4, control is how they vary. So what are you trying to explain, right? What are you trying to control? How are you trying to intervene in whatever it is you happen to be looking at? What makes a discipline a science, and this is where if you ever hear people talk about soft sciences and hard sciences, oh, that's a real science, oh, that's just a social science, it's fluffy, it's all opinion. No, 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 no. What makes it a real science is that there are standardized ways that we do our work, that there are prescribed specific methods that are used, and that the processes that social sciences or animal sciences use can be repeated by somebody else. And that when somebody else did the same thing that you did, asking the same question that you asked, they would get the same answer. So when we say something is true, what we mean by that is this person has asked that question and collected the data and looked at the pattern, and somebody else has done the same thing. And because it is repeated, that's what it means by being reliable. I think that's in your textbook. I don't know. I may have jumped into graduate school research methods. I don't know. But when research can be repeated, it's said to be reliable and therefore true. When you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring, what you intend to measure. So for instance, if a psychologist wanted to measure happiness, well, first of all, how do you define happiness and how do you measure it? That is a really important term called conceptualization. So I might conceptualize happiness as somebody who has a smile on their face all the time. You might define happiness as somebody who's simply not sad. You'll do your research on people who are simply not sad, and I will do my research on people who smile. We'll probably come up with two different answers, with two different conclusions, because we're not measuring the same thing, right? So that's really what the key is. I mean, that's the challenge about doing any research with people. And that's why you can find two different conclusions, two different research projects that ask the same question, but they come up with different answers because you have to look really closely. How did they measure that? Who did they ask? Did they only ask 2 people? Did they only ask old people? Did they only ask young people? Did they only ask women? You're going to get a different answer. And that's what's referred to as, I want to see if it's in your textbook, your operational definition. That's what we mean by conceptualization. Replicate. That means it's reliable. That means if I do it again, I'll get the same answer, right? I think I'm talking about a population, right? as opposed to a case study. Maybe I'll just use the textbook. A case study, and psychologists use case studies, sociologists would, well, they would, but not like these guys do. A psychologist might use one person as an example, and they might draw a conclusion about one person. For instance, the story about Gage, you remember Phineas Gage? One person. He was a case study. And then they would draw conclusions. Then they would take those conclusions into the real world and they would replicate it. They would look for another Phineas Gage and ask the same questions. And if they came up with the same answer, they could say, oh, their findings were replicatable, therefore they're valid, right? If you turn into your book to page, I think I'm on page 18, you have something called a naturalistic observation. And this is what we're all naturalistic researchers. That's just when you go out and you just watch, right? And you actually collect your observations in the environment. Let's example it. It says from watching chimpanzees. So you just go where your subjects are and you observe them. The survey is what most people think about. The survey is you ask a whole bunch of people questions and then you tally them up. Matter of fact, I'm in the process of writing one right now, writing one for my church. Oh, here you go, a population. A population is who are you gonna ask these questions to? My population for my research project is my whole church congregation, everybody. Do you think everybody's gonna respond? Nope, not. So I end up with a sample. A random sample is when I just throw it out there and see who picks it up, right? And we could go into different kinds of samples. A really important term, this is a really important term, and I've noticed I'm past my 10 minutes, but I want to highlight these last couple terms, is the difference between a correlation and a causation. Very important distinction. Causation says this causes that. I eat too much, I eat more than calories than I burn, I gain fatty tissue. Causation. A correlation says, as this happens too. One doesn't really cause the other, but they seem to happen together. They seem to be correlated. My favorite example is the correlation between more money and happiness. Does money cause happiness? Don't think so. But the data suggests that as people earn more money, their happiness goes up, but only to a certain point, only to about $70,000. And then they can continue to earn more money, but their happiness levels off. So there is a correlation. And then you have something called a positive correlation. A positive correlation means two things go together. Or a negative correlation means two things go together down, right? So yeah, as this goes up, that goes up. Or as that goes down, wait, how's that work? Maybe as that goes down, you get what I'm talking about. Correlation. Correlation is not causation, right? We don't know enough about the human condition to say this causes that. You're not likely to hear social sciences say this is cause, this causes that. But they will probably say this is correlated with that. We see these things together an awful lot. We're still trying to figure out how. Experiment, we'll talk a little bit about experiments. That's where you have things like control variables, right? You have this group over here. Okay, so you have the group that gets the drug and the group that doesn't get the drug, and you're going to experiment to see the effect of the drug. In order to experiment to see if the drug cures COVID, some folks can't get the drug. And that's what's called a blind or a double blind. It means that we don't know. We don't know if this guy got the drug or not, or this guy got the drug, but we're going to wait and see if they get better. And then after they get better, they don't get better, then we'll find out if they got the drug. So I'm not going to ask you quiz questions about all this. And I probably, as we go through the semester, I'll say, well, this is an example of that. And I'll try to explain the research, like how they answer the question. But it's a pretty big part of your chapter. So I wanted to make sure I had at least looked over it. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's probably it for now. So this officially wraps up chapter 1 of your psychology textbook. The next chapter that we will get to is the neuroscience. It's the biology, and I'll see if I can't get a good brain model for us. Bye for now.